Mom, let's be realistic. You can't afford decent Christmas gifts for the kids this year. Maybe just stick to dollar store stuff so you don't embarrass yourself. Those words from my daughter Carly shattered something inside me. After building a real estate empire worth $40 million, after quietly establishing a $3.2 million trust fund for her children's future, this is what I had become in her eyes. A broke old woman who shopped at discount stores. What Carly didn't know was that the day before her crushing comment, I had just signed the final paperwork making her children the beneficiaries of the largest trust fund our family attorney had ever managed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, sitting in my modest two-bedroom apartment that I chose for simplicity rather than necessity, I made a decision that would change everything. That trust fund she never knew existed. It was about to disappear just as quietly as it had been created. My name is Marjorie Liston, and for the past 30 years, I've been living a carefully constructed lie. Not the kind of lie that hurts people, but the kind that protects your family from the corrupting influence of easy money. While my daughter Carly struggled through her 20s and 30s building her marketing career, while my son-in-law Edward complained about their mortgage payments and private school costs, I quietly assembled a real estate portfolio that most people only dream about. It started innocently enough. My late husband Randy had been a school principal, and I worked as a secretary at the county courthouse. We lived modestly in a small ranch house on Maple Street, driving used cars and clipping coupons like everyone else in our middle-class neighborhood. But Randy had taught me something valuable during our 25 years together. Marjorie, he used to say, the best investments are the ones nobody else wants to make. When Randy passed away 15 years ago from a sudden heart attack, I was devastated. The $200,000 life insurance policy felt like nothing compared to losing my best friend and partner. But Randy had also left me with something else: a keen eye for undervalued property, and the patience to wait for the right opportunities. The courthouse job became my secret weapon. I saw every foreclosure filing, every tax lien, every property dispute before they hit the public records. While other investors were reading about opportunities in newspapers, I was learning about them months in advance. I started small, buying a rundown duplex for $15,000 at a tax sale. The previous owner had abandoned it after a fire damaged the kitchen, but the structure was sound. I spent weekends learning to do basic repairs from YouTube videos, gradually transforming that duplex into something livable. When I rented it out for $800 a month, Carly thought it was just a nice little hobby that helped me stay busy after losing her father. "It's sweet that you're keeping yourself occupied, Mom," she'd say patronizingly, never asking about the actual numbers. That first duplex became two duplexes, then a small apartment building, then a strip mall that I purchased when the original owner defaulted on his loan. Each success funded the next opportunity, and I reinvested every dollar rather than changing my lifestyle. To my family and friends, I remained the same modest widow, living in the same small house, driving the same 10-year-old Honda Civic. The real breakthrough came 5 years ago, when the city announced plans for a new shopping complex on the outskirts of town. I had been quietly purchasing the surrounding farmland for months, paying cash for properties that farmers were eager to sell to cover medical bills or retirement costs. When the development was officially announced, my $400,000 investment was suddenly worth $12 million. Instead of celebrating publicly or moving to a mansion, I made a different choice. I sold the original family home, the one where Carly and her brother Charlie had grown up, and moved into a modest apartment in a senior living community. Not because I had to, but because I wanted the freedom that comes with not worrying about maintenance, yard work, or the constant reminders of Randy's absence. Carly was horrified by the move. "Mom, you don't have to live in some tiny apartment," she protested. "Edward and I could help with the house payments if money's tight." The assumption that I was struggling financially became the foundation of all our family interactions from that point forward. I never corrected her misconception, partly because I enjoyed the simplicity of my new life, but mostly because I was curious to see how my children would treat me when they thought I had nothing to offer them financially. The results were educational. Charlie, who lived across the country with his wife Helena, called dutifully once a month but never offered to help with anything. He assumed I was getting by okay on Randy's pension and Social Security. When he did visit, he'd make comments about finding me a nice little part-time job to help with expenses, never imagining that I owned the building where he suggested I apply for work. But it was Carly who truly revealed the depth of her assumptions about my circumstances. She lived just 20 minutes away with Edward and their 2 children, 8-year-old Manny and 6-year-old Candace. Over the years, she developed a pattern of treating me like a charity case who needed careful management. She'd arrive at my apartment with grocery store coupons that might help stretch your budget, or boxes of clothes that Manny and Candace had outgrown in case you know someone who could use them. When I took the grandchildren out for ice cream or to a movie, she'd quietly slip me a $20 bill afterward, whispering, "For the treats, Mom. I know every little bit helps." The condescension was wrapped in genuine love, which made it both more bearable and more painful. Carly truly believed she was being a good daughter by managing my supposedly limited finances and protecting me from expenses I couldn't afford. She had no idea that the retirement community where I lived was actually one of 3 senior housing developments that I owned through a holding company. 6 months ago, I made what I thought would be the most generous gesture of my life. Working with my attorney, Jay Bridge, I established a comprehensive trust fund for Manny and Candace. The $3.2 million fund would cover their complete education through graduate school, provide them with starter homes when they turned 25, and give them the foundation for financial independence that every grandparent dreams of providing. Jay had suggested informing Carly and Edward about the trust, but I wanted to surprise them at Christmas. I imagined their faces when I revealed that their financial worries about college tuition and the children's futures were completely unnecessary. I pictured the relief, the gratitude, the understanding that their struggling mother had actually secured their children's entire futures. I had planned to announce it on Christmas morning, after the children opened their presents, but before the big family dinner. It would be my gift to the whole family: security, peace of mind, and the knowledge that 3 generations of careful planning had created something lasting. But then came that December afternoon when everything changed, when Carly's casual cruelty about my supposed poverty made me realize that my family's respect for me was entirely conditional on their perception of my circumstances. The trust fund that was supposed to be revealed in 3 weeks became the secret weapon I never expected to need. The December afternoon that changed everything started innocently enough. I had spent the morning reviewing quarterly reports from my property management company, Sunset Holdings, which handled the day-to-day operations of my real estate portfolio. The numbers were particularly good that month, occupancy rates at 96% across all properties, and the new shopping center had just signed 2 major anchor tenants that would boost rental income by 40%. I was feeling generous, perhaps even a bit guilty about maintaining the charade of modest means for so long. Carly and Edward had been stressed about Christmas expenses, dropping hints about the cost of the children's wish lists and how difficult it was to make the season special on their budget. They had no idea that I could have bought every item in both kids' letters to Santa without checking my bank balance. So I decided to do something I rarely did: venture into what Carly would consider real shopping. Instead of my usual practical purchases at discount stores, which I genuinely preferred for their simplicity, I drove to Riverside Mall to find something special for Manny and Candace. The toy store was overwhelming in the way that only December shopping can be. Parents rushed between aisles with lists and stressed expressions, children pointed excitedly at displays, and harried employees tried to keep up with the chaos. I found myself genuinely enjoying the experience, taking my time to consider what would truly delight my grandchildren. For Manny, who had been fascinated by astronomy since a school visit to the planetarium, I selected a high-quality telescope that could grow with his interest. It wasn't the most expensive one in the store, but at $300 it was a serious piece of equipment that would let him explore his passion properly. For Candace, who spent hours drawing elaborate fairy kingdoms, I chose a deluxe art set with professional-grade colored pencils, watercolors, and a beautiful wooden easel that could be adjusted as she grew. I also couldn't resist picking up a few smaller items: science experiment kits, books, puzzles, the kind of gifts that create memories and encourage learning. By the time I finished, I had spent nearly $800, which represented about 30 minutes of rental income from my properties. The shopping bags were heavier than I expected. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And I was struggling slightly as I made my way through the mall's main corridor when I spotted a familiar figure near the food court. Carly was sitting at a small table with her friend Suzanne Cole, their heads bent together in the kind of intense conversation that usually meant someone was sharing particularly juicy gossip. I was about to approach them when I caught fragments of their discussion that made me freeze in place behind a decorative pillar. "I'm just worried about Mom this Christmas," Carly was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone of exaggerated concern that I had learned to recognize. "She's been trying so hard to seem independent since Dad died, but the reality is that she can barely afford her rent at that place." Suzanne made sympathetic noises while sipping her latte. "It's hard when they get older and lose touch with how expensive things have become." "Exactly," Carly continued, warming to her theme. "Last week she mentioned wanting to take the kids shopping for Christmas gifts, and I had to gently explain that maybe she should stick to smaller items this year. You know, dollar store stuff, maybe some homemade cookies." I felt terrible having to manage her expectations like that, but I couldn't let her spend money she doesn't have just to try to compete with what Edward and I can afford. The shopping bags in my hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy, not from their physical weight, but from the crushing realization of how thoroughly my daughter had misunderstood my situation and, more importantly, how comfortable she was discussing my supposed poverty with her friends. "That's so sweet of you to look out for her," Suzanne replied. "My mother-in-law is the same way. She has no concept of money anymore. Last month she tried to insist on paying for lunch at a restaurant that cost more than she probably spends on food in a week. We had to practically wrestle the check away from her." Carly laughed, a sound that felt like a physical blow. "Right? It's like they forget they're on fixed incomes. Mom keeps talking about getting nice as gifts for Manny and Candace, and I'm like, Mom, they're 8 and 6. They won't remember if their grandmother's presents came from Target or the Dollar Tree." But she gets so defensive when I try to help her understand the financial reality. I stood there, hidden behind the pillar, watching my daughter discuss my imaginary financial limitations with the casual confidence of someone who had never questioned her assumptions. The most painful part wasn't the condescension, it was the genuine belief in her voice that she was being protective and helpful. "The hardest part," Carly continued, "is that she's too proud to let us help directly. Edward suggested we could give her some money specifically for Christmas gifts, but she'd never accept it. So I've been trying to subtly manage the situation. I told her maybe this year she could focus on spending time with the kids instead of buying expensive presents. Quality time over quantity, you know." "You're such a good daughter," Suzanne assured her. "It's not easy being the adult in the relationship when your parents start struggling." The phrase "being the adult in the relationship" hit me like a physical slap. At 63, having built a business empire through careful planning and strategic thinking, having made financial decisions that would secure multiple generations of my family's future, I was apparently the child in this dynamic who needed to be managed and protected from my own poor judgment. I left the mall without approaching them, driving home in a fog of hurt and anger. The expensive gifts sat in my passenger seat like evidence of my supposed delusion, proof that I was exactly the out-of-touch old woman who needed her daughter's guidance to navigate basic financial reality. That evening, I sat in my modest apartment, which I could have decorated with furniture worth more than most people's annual salaries if I had chosen to, and truly understood for the first time how completely I had succeeded in my deception. Too successfully, perhaps. The trust fund documents were in my bedroom safe, waiting for Christmas morning. $3.2 million, carefully structured to provide for every educational and life milestone my grandchildren might face. Money that represented not just my love for them, but my faith in their potential and my desire to give them opportunities I had never had. But as I sat there that night, replaying Carly's words about dollar store gifts and being the adult in our relationship, I began to question whether that faith and love were flowing in both directions. If my daughter could speak so casually about managing my limitations, what did that say about how she truly saw me as a person? For the first time since establishing the trust, I wondered if I was making a mistake. The next morning, I woke with unusual clarity, The hurt from overhearing Carly's conversation had crystallized into something more purposeful overnight, a recognition that I had inadvertently created a test, and my daughter had failed it more completely than I could have imagined. I made coffee in the small kitchen of my apartment and sat by the window that overlooked the community garden. Most people assumed I lived here because it was all I could afford, but the truth was that I had chosen Willowbrook Senior Community specifically because it offered something money couldn't buy: anonymity. Here, I was just Marjorie from 4B, the quiet widow who kept to herself, and occasionally helped with the community newsletter. What they didn't know was that I owned the entire complex through a shell corporation, along with 2 similar properties across the state. The monthly rent I paid myself was a convenient accounting practice that amused my financial advisor more than it probably should have. As I sat there, watching Mrs. Howard from 3A, tending to her tomato plants, I made a decision that would change everything. Not an emotional reactive choice, but the kind of calculated business decision that had built my empire in the first place. I would let Christmas play out exactly as Carly expected it to. I called Jay Bridges' office and scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon. Jay had been my attorney for 8 years, ever since my previous lawyer retired to Florida with his wife. Unlike his predecessor, who had known me since Randy's death and watched my transformation from struggling widow to property mogul, Jay had inherited me as an established client. To him, I was simply another wealthy retiree who preferred privacy to ostentation. His office reflected the kind of understated success that impressed clients without intimidating them: leather-bound books, oriental rugs, and windows that looked out over downtown's historic district. Jay himself was in his mid-40s, sharp-eyed and methodical, the kind of lawyer who built trust through competence rather than charm. "Marjorie," he said, as his assistant showed me into the conference room, "this is unexpected. Is everything all right with the trust documents?" I settled into the familiar chair across from his mahogany desk and got straight to the point. "I want to make significant changes to the Manny and Candace Trust Fund immediately." Jay's expression shifted to professional concern. He pulled out a thick folder and spread the documents across his desk. "What kind of changes? Are you having second thoughts about the distribution schedule? The educational provisions? I want to dissolve it entirely." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the antique clock on his mantel ticking. Jay's pen stopped mid-motion above his legal pad, and he looked at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. "Dissolve it? Marjorie, this represents $3.2 million. You've spent months structuring this trust to provide for your grandchildren's entire futures. Their education, their first homes, their business ventures, everything is planned out through their 40th birthdays. What could have possibly changed?" I had expected this reaction. Jay was thorough, cautious, and protective of his client's interests. Dissolving a major trust fund on short notice would trigger every professional alarm bell he possessed. "I've realized that the assumptions I made when creating this trust may have been incorrect," I said carefully. "I need to reassess whether this is truly in the children's best interests." Jay set down his pen entirely and leaned back in his chair. "Marjorie, forgive me, but I've never seen you make an impulsive financial decision. This trust fund has been your primary focus for months. You've consulted with tax specialists, education planners, and financial advisors. The structure is nearly perfect. What's really going on here?" I appreciated his directness. It was one of the reasons I had kept him as my attorney when he took over the practice. But some decisions couldn't be explained through spreadsheets and legal precedents. "Let me ask you something, Jay. In your experience, does receiving a large inheritance at a young age typically improve someone's character or diminish it?" He considered the question seriously. "That depends entirely on the family dynamics and how the inheritance is structured. In your case, you've built in educational requirements, matching provisions for earned income, and delayed distributions specifically to prevent entitlement issues. You've done everything right. But what if the entitlement already exists? What if the parents have already established patterns of thinking that would undermine everything the trust is meant to accomplish?" Jay's expression shifted as he began to understand that this wasn't about legal structures or financial planning. "Has something happened with Carly and Edward?" I told him about the overheard conversation at the mall, about Carly's casual dismissal of my supposed financial limitations, about the pattern of condescension that had been building for years. I explained how my daughter had become comfortable managing what she perceived as my declining circumstances, never questioning whether her assumptions might be wrong. She sees me as a financial burden who needs protection from my own poor judgment, I concluded. If that's how she views someone she believes has nothing, how do you think she'll treat her children when they suddenly have access to millions? Jay was quiet for a long time, absently straightening the papers on his desk while he processed what I had told him. Finally, he looked up with the expression he usually reserved for complex legal puzzles. "You're not just dissolving the trust," he said slowly. "You're conducting an experiment. You want to see how your family treats you when they believe you have nothing to offer them financially." "The experiment has already been conducted," I corrected. "For 5 years, I've lived as they think I live, and I've seen exactly who they are when they believe I'm powerless. Now I need to decide what to do with that information." Jay nodded thoughtfully. "And Christmas is your deadline." Christmas was supposed to be when I revealed the trust fund. Instead, it's going to be when I confirm whether dissolving it is the right choice. He pulled out a fresh legal pad and began making notes. "If we're going to do this, we need to be strategic about it. Dissolving a trust this size creates tax implications, and we'll need to restructure your estate plan accordingly. But more importantly, if you change your mind later, recreating something this complex will be expensive and time-consuming." "What if we don't dissolve it permanently?" I asked. "What if we put it into a kind of suspension? Keep the money set aside, but remove the current beneficiaries?" Jay's pen stopped moving. "You mean create a holding structure that could be reactivated under different terms?" "Exactly. The money remains dedicated to the grandchildren's benefit, but only if certain conditions are met. Not financial conditions, character conditions." For the first time since I had walked into his office, Jay smiled. "Now that's the Marjorie Liston I know. You're not making an emotional decision, you're making a strategic one with multiple contingencies." We spent the next 2 hours restructuring the trust into what Jay called a conditional legacy fund. The money would remain untouchable, earning interest but not committed to any specific beneficiaries, until I decided they had demonstrated the kind of character that deserved such a gift. As I left his office that afternoon, I felt the same calm certainty that had guided me through decades of successful property investments. I wasn't destroying my grandchildren's future, I was protecting it from parents who might teach them that wealth was something owed rather than earned, even when that wealth came from love. Christmas was still 2 weeks away, plenty of time for Carly to surprise me, to show that her concern came from genuine caring rather than condescending pity. But I wasn't optimistic. The week following my meeting with Jay brought a series of interactions that confirmed my worst fears about how deeply entrenched Carly's condescending attitudes had become. It was as if the universe was providing me with a comprehensive demonstration of exactly why suspending the trust fund had been the right decision. It started on Tuesday when Carly called to discuss Christmas dinner plans. I had hosted the family gathering for the past 3 years, a tradition that had evolved naturally after Randy's death when everyone wanted to help me feel less alone during the holidays. What had begun as genuine kindness had gradually transformed into something that felt more like charity management. "Mom, I've been thinking," Carly began, using the careful tone she reserved for delicate topics. "Maybe this year Edward and I should host Christmas dinner at our house. I know you love having everyone over, but it's such a big expense and so much work for you." I was sitting at my small dining table, reviewing rental income reports that showed December had been one of my most profitable months ever. 3 of my commercial properties had renewed their leases at increased rates, and the holiday shopping season had boosted retail revenues across my strip mall portfolio. The irony of her concern about my ability to afford a Christmas dinner was almost amusing. "I appreciate the offer, dear, but I enjoy hosting," I replied. "I've already ordered the turkey and planned the menu." There was a pause that I had learned to recognize as Carly gathering patience to deal with my supposed stubbornness. "Mom, turkey prices have gone up so much this year, and with all the sides, the wine, the desserts, it adds up to hundreds of dollars. Edward and I can easily handle the expense, and our dining room is bigger anyway." "The expense isn't a concern for me, Carly. I know you think it isn't," she said, with the gentle firmness of someone explaining reality to a child, "but but I've been worried about your budget lately. The other day when we went to lunch, you seemed to calculate the tip very carefully, and I noticed you've been using a lot more coupons when we shop together. The lunch she was referring to had been at Giuseppe's, a mid-level Italian restaurant, where I had indeed calculated the tip carefully, because I always tipped exactly 22%, a habit I had developed years ago to honor Randy's memory. He had worked as a waiter briefly in college and always insisted on generous but precise tipping. As for the coupons, I genuinely enjoyed finding good deals. Saving money had been how I built my empire in the first place. Carly, I can afford to host Christmas dinner, I said more firmly. Of course you can afford it, she replied quickly. But should you? Wouldn't it be smarter to save that money for things you really need? What if your car needs repairs, or the apartment raises your rent, or you have medical expenses? Her concerns sounded so genuine, so loving, that it took me a moment to recognize the fundamental disrespect embedded in her words. She was discussing my financial decisions, as if I were an elderly relative sliding into dementia who needed to be protected from my own poor judgment. I think I can manage my own finances, dear. I know you can, she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. I just want to make sure you're being realistic about your situation. Living on a fixed income is challenging, and I'd hate for you to put yourself in a difficult position trying to keep up with expenses you don't need to handle anymore. After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone for several minutes. Fixed income. The phrase kept echoing in my mind. If Carly had any idea what my actual monthly income was, she would have been stunned into silence. The situation escalated on Thursday when I made the mistake of mentioning that I was considering getting a cleaning service for the apartment. Mom, those services are incredibly expensive, Carly said, during one of her now daily check-in calls. I looked into it once, and they charge like $40 or $50 just for a basic cleaning. For your little apartment, you're probably looking at $200 a month minimum. In reality, I had already researched local services and found several that charged exactly what Carly quoted. What she didn't know was that $200 represented roughly the amount of rental income I earned every 6 hours. Maybe Helena and I could take turns coming over to help you clean, she suggested. We could make it a family activity, bring the kids, let them help with simple tasks. It would save you the money and give us more time together. The image of my daughter and daughter-in-law cleaning my apartment while I supervised like an invalid was so horrifying that I immediately rejected the idea, perhaps more sharply than I intended. That's absolutely not necessary, Carly. I'm perfectly capable of cleaning my own apartment. Of course you are, she said, in that maddeningly patient voice. But why struggle with heavy work when you have family who want to help? There's no shame in accepting assistance, Mom. We want to take care of you the way you took care of us. The way she phrased it, taking care of me, made my skin crawl. I wasn't someone who needed care. I was a successful businesswoman who had chosen to live simply, not someone whose circumstances had forced simplicity upon them. The final straw came on Saturday when Carly arrived unannounced with grocery bags and an apologetic smile. I was at Costco anyway and thought I'd pick up some basics for you, she said, bustling past me into the kitchen. I know you usually shop at that little market down the street, but their prices are ridiculous for what you get. She began unpacking bulk quantities of items I would never use: industrial-sized containers of coffee, enormous boxes of cereal, family packs of meat that were far too large for one person. The subtext was clear: she was buying me cheaper per unit groceries to help stretch my imaginary limited budget. Carly, I appreciate the gesture, but I really don't need. Don't be proud, Mom, she interrupted, continuing to stock my refrigerator and pantry. This is what families do. Edward and I spend this much on groceries every week anyway. It's no hardship for us to include some extra items for you. I watched her organize my kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had clearly thought this through, probably discussing with Edward how best to help poor Mom without making her feel like charity. The groceries represented maybe $40 of bulk shopping, a generous gesture from her perspective, but one that assumed I couldn't afford to feed myself properly. Besides, she continued, holding up a package of store-brand frozen vegetables, This way you'll have healthy options readily available. I worry that you're not eating enough variety when you have to be so careful about every purchase. Careful about every purchase. There it was again, the assumption that every financial decision I made was driven by scarcity rather than choice. As she finished organizing the groceries she had brought, Carly turned to me with the satisfied expression of someone who had solved a problem. There, now you won't have to worry about running out of staples, and you can save your grocery money for treats or emergencies. After she left, I stood in my kitchen surrounded by bulk groceries I hadn't asked for and didn't need, feeling a level of frustration I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't kindness, it was management. Carly had decided I was too poor or too incompetent to feed myself adequately, and she had taken it upon herself to solve that problem without even consulting me. That evening, I called Jay Bridge at his home office. "Jay, I need you to expedite the trust fund modifications," I said without preamble. "How quickly can we have the new structure finalized?" "I can have the papers ready by Monday," he replied. "Marjorie, are you certain about this?" "Once we implement these changes, I'm certain," I interrupted. "More certain than I've ever been about anything." As I hung up, I realized that Christmas was exactly 1 week away. 7 more days to see if Carly could surprise me, if she could demonstrate even a moment of respect for my autonomy or recognition of my competence. But after the week I had just endured, I already knew how this story was going to end. Monday morning brought the call I had been both dreading and anticipating. Carly's voice carried that particular mixture of determination and forced cheerfulness that I had learned to recognize as her problem-solving mode. "Mom, I need to be honest with you about something," she began, and I could practically hear her gathering courage. "Edward and I have been talking, and we're concerned about your Christmas gift situation." I was sitting in my home office, the second bedroom of my apartment that I had converted into a workspace where I managed my property empire. Spread across my desk were contracts for 2 new acquisitions I was considering: a small office building downtown and a residential complex that would add 12 more units to my rental portfolio. The combined value of these potential purchases exceeded what most people earned in a lifetime. "What kind of concerns?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Well, you mentioned wanting to get nice as gifts for Manny and Candace, and we just want to make sure you're not putting financial pressure on yourself. Kids their age are happy with anything. They don't need expensive presents to know their grandmother loves them." I set down the contract I had been reviewing and gave Carly my full attention. "What exactly are you suggesting?" There was a pause, then the sound of rustling papers. "Actually, Edward and I went ahead and picked out some gifts that you could give to the kids. We got them from Target, nothing too fancy, but nice enough that you won't feel embarrassed. We thought maybe you could reimburse us later, or we could just say they're from you if money's really tight this month." The casual assumption that I would be embarrassed by my own gift choices hit me like a physical blow. Even worse was the offer to let me claim credit for presents they had chosen and purchased, as if I were a charitable cause they needed to manage discreetly. "That's very thoughtful," I said carefully, "but I've already purchased gifts for the children." "Oh," the surprise in her voice was unmistakable. "What did you get them?" "I just want to make sure there's no overlap. And also, well, I hope you kept the receipts in case you need to return anything." "Why would I need to return anything?" Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, sometimes when people are on tight budgets, they make impulse purchases that seem like good ideas at the time, but aren't really practical. There's no shame in that. It happens to everyone. But if you spent more than you should have, we can help you take things back and find more affordable alternatives." I looked around my office, taking in the financial documents that represented decades of careful planning and strategic thinking. On my computer screen was an email from my accountant, showing that my net worth had increased by $2.3 million in the past year alone. And here was my daughter, offering to help me return Christmas gifts, because she assumed I had made irresponsible purchases I couldn't afford. "The gifts I bought are appropriate and within my budget," I said firmly. "I'm sure they seemed that way when you bought them," Carly replied, with that patient tone that had become so familiar. But sometimes we don't realize how much we're spending until we see it all together. Remember when you said you spent almost $800 at the mall? That's more than some people spend on groceries in a month, Mom. There it was. The confirmation that she had been calculating my supposed overspending, probably losing sleep over her poor mother's financial irresponsibility. $800, which represented roughly 3 hours of my passive income, had become evidence of my declining judgment and need for supervision. Carly, I want you to listen very carefully, I said. I am not returning the gifts I bought for my grandchildren. I can afford them, and I chose them thoughtfully. Your concern is noted, but it's not necessary. The silence that followed stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new edge of frustration. Mom, I know you want to maintain your independence, and I respect that. But part of being a good daughter is not letting my mother make financial mistakes that could hurt her later. What if you need that $800 for medical bills or car repairs? What if something happens and you can't pay your rent? Then I'll handle it, I said simply. But why risk it? Why put yourself in that position when Edward and I are perfectly capable of handling Christmas gifts? We want to do this, Mom. We want to take care of you. There was that phrase again. Take care of you, not spend time with you, not celebrate with you, not include you, take care of you, like I was a burden to be managed rather than a person to be respected. I appreciate your offer, but my decision is final. Carly's frustration finally broke through her carefully maintained patience. Mom, sometimes I feel like you're not being realistic about your situation. Living on Social Security and Dad's pension isn't the same as having a regular income. You have to be more careful now, whether you want to admit it or not. Social Security and Randy's pension. I almost laughed at the irony. Those two sources of income, which Carly assumed represented the entirety of my financial resources, wouldn't have covered the property taxes on my real estate portfolio, let alone my actual living expenses. I understand your concerns, I said, choosing my words carefully, but I'm more financially secure than you realize. I know you like to think that, she replied, and I could practically hear her exchanging knowing looks with Edward, who was probably listening on the other extension. But thinking something and having it be true aren't the same thing. I've seen your apartment, Mom. I know what you drive, where you shop, how you live. I'm not judging, I'm just being realistic about what your income allows. And there it was, laid out with brutal clarity. My daughter had constructed an entire narrative about my financial situation, based on external observations, and she was so confident in her assumptions that she couldn't imagine being wrong. The apartment, the car, the shopping habits, all evidence of limitations that existed only in her mind. Carly, I said quietly, what if your assumptions about my financial situation are incorrect? She laughed, but it wasn't a mean sound, more like the patient amusement of someone dealing with a beloved relative's harmless delusion. Mom, I love you, but I can see how you live. There's nothing wrong with being on a fixed income at your age. Most people would be thrilled to have what you have. You just need to accept it, and stop trying to spend like you're still young with a full-time job. After we hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the acquisition contracts on my desk. My daughter had just told me, with absolute confidence, that I needed to accept my financial limitations and stop trying to spend money I didn't have. The trust fund documents were still in my safe, waiting for Christmas morning. $3.2 million that would have transformed my grandchildren's lives, established by a woman my own daughter believed was too poor to buy decent Christmas presents. I picked up the phone and called Jay Bridge one more time. Jay, I need those new trust documents ready by tomorrow. It's time to make this official. Tuesday afternoon brought an encounter that would have been amusing if it hadn't been so deeply hurtful. I was leaving my monthly meeting with my financial advisor when I spotted Carly and Edward huddled together at a corner table in the coffee shop across the street from the investment building. Their body language suggested an intense private conversation, and something about their furtive demeanor made me pause. I should have kept walking. I should have respected their privacy and continued to my car. But after weeks of condescending phone calls and unsolicited charity groceries, I found myself curious about what crisis required such urgent discussion. So I did something I had never done before in my 63 years. I eavesdropped on my own family. The coffee shop was busy enough that I could claim a small table near theirs, without seeming conspicuous. I ordered a latte I didn't want, and opened a magazine I wasn't reading, all while straining to hear their conversation over the ambient noise of espresso machines and casual chatter. What I heard made my blood run cold. The gifts aren't the real problem, Edward was saying, his voice low but urgent. It's what they represent. She's clearly losing touch with financial reality, and it's only going to get worse. Carly nodded, stirring her coffee with the mechanical precision of someone deep in thought. I know. The $800 at the mall was just the beginning. Yesterday she told me she was considering hiring a cleaning service. Do you know what those cost? More than she can afford, obviously. The question is what we do about it. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. They were discussing me like I was a problem to be solved, a situation that required their intervention and management. I've been doing research, Carly continued, pulling out her phone. There are legal options for when elderly parents become unable to make sound financial decisions, something called guardianship or conservatorship. It would give us legal authority to protect her from herself. Edward leaned forward, interested. You mean like taking control of her accounts? Exactly. We could make sure her rent gets paid, her basic needs are met, but prevent her from making these impulsive purchases that could leave her destitute. It's for her own protection. I gripped my coffee cup so tightly, I was surprised it didn't shatter. My daughter, my own child, was researching legal ways to have me declared incompetent so they could control my finances. The woman who had built a $40 million empire through strategic thinking and careful planning was being discussed as if she were a confused elderly person who needed to be protected from her own poor judgment. Is that something we could actually do? Edward asked. I mean, she seems pretty sharp most of the time. That's the thing, Carly replied, warming to her subject. Mental decline isn't always obvious at first. It starts with small things, like spending money you don't have on gifts, or not understanding that your fixed income has limits. The fact that she seems normal in other ways might actually work in our favor. We could argue that she's hiding her confusion out of pride. The calculated coldness in her voice was almost more shocking than her words. This wasn't a concerned daughter worried about her mother's well-being. This was someone strategizing how to gain control of what they assumed were limited, but still valuable assets. What about Charlie? Edward asked. Would we need his consent? Carly waved dismissively. Charlie lives across the country and barely calls. He's probably been assuming we're handling Mom's situation anyway. I doubt he'd object to us making it official. And the kids would benefit too, Edward added, as if trying to justify what they were planning. If we're managing her finances responsibly, there might be something left for them eventually. Otherwise, she could spend it all on impulse purchases and have nothing to leave anyone. Something left for them eventually. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. They were discussing my supposed inheritance as if it were already theirs, calculating how to preserve assets they believed I was squandering through my financial incompetence. Exactly, Carly agreed. This isn't just about protecting Mom, it's about protecting the family's future. Manny and Candace deserve to have something from their grandmother, but not if she spends it all on expensive Christmas presents and cleaning services she doesn't need. I sat there, stunned by the comprehensive misunderstanding of my situation, and worse, by the casual way they were planning to take control of my life. They had observed my modest lifestyle and constructed an entire fantasy about my declining mental state and irresponsible spending, then used that fantasy to justify legal action that would strip me of my autonomy. The timing might actually be perfect, Edward mused. If she's planning to spend big on Christmas gifts this year, we could use that as evidence of her impaired judgment. $800 might not seem like much to us, but for someone on her budget, it's proof of irresponsible decision-making. I've been documenting everything, Carly said, pulling out a small notebook. The gifts, the cleaning service comment, the way she insisted on hosting Christmas dinner despite the expense. I have dates, amounts, and witnesses for most of it. Witnesses. I realized with growing horror that Suzanne Cole and probably other friends had been recruited as observers of my supposedly declining condition. Conversations I had thought were casual social interactions had actually been intelligence-gathering sessions for my daughter's legal case against my competency. There's something else, Carly continued, lowering her voice even further. I think she might be hiding debt from us. Remember how defensive she got when I offered to help with Christmas dinner? And she's been acting strange lately, like she's keeping secrets. The irony was so complete it was almost funny. Yes, I had been keeping secrets, the secret of my wealth, my success, my financial security, but Carly had interpreted my privacy as evidence of shame and decline, rather than the deliberate choice of someone who valued discretion over ostentation. How long would something like this take? Edward asked. Few months, probably. We'd need medical evaluations, financial assessments, court hearings, but once it's established, we'd have complete control over her finances. We could set up a reasonable monthly allowance for her personal expenses and make sure all her bills are paid properly. An allowance. They were planning to give me an allowance from my own money, doled out like pocket money to a child who couldn't be trusted with the full amount. I left the coffee shop while they were still planning their intervention, walking to my car in a daze of hurt and disbelief. The trust fund documents that Jay had prepared were sitting on my passenger seat, waiting for my signature. $3.2 million that would have secured my grandchildren's futures, established by a woman whose own daughter was planning to have her declared mentally incompetent. As I drove home, I realized that Carly's condescension over the past weeks hadn't been the worst of it. It had been preparation, documentation for a legal case that would paint me as a confused elderly woman whose poor judgment posed a threat to herself and her family's financial security. That evening, I signed the papers that transferred the trust fund into a conditional holding structure. The money would remain untouched, earning interest, but no longer designated for specific beneficiaries. My grandchildren's financial future now depended entirely on their parents, demonstrating the kind of character that deserved such a gift. Based on what I had heard that afternoon, it was going to be a very long wait. The revelation of Carly and Edward's legal machinations had accomplished something I hadn't expected. It had transformed my hurt into cold, calculated anger. The kind of anger that didn't lead to emotional outbursts, but to strategic planning. If they wanted to play legal games with someone they assumed was a confused elderly woman, they were about to discover just how sharp my supposedly declining mind actually was. Wednesday morning found me in the offices of Peterson and Associates, the most prestigious law firm in the city. I had called in a favor from a contact at the Chamber of Commerce to secure an immediate appointment with Margaret Peterson herself, a woman whose reputation for handling complex family litigation was matched only by her discretion with high-net-worth clients. Margaret was in her 50s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of sharp intelligence that radiated from her eyes when she listened. Her office reflected her success without being ostentatious, expensive furniture that whispered rather than shouted, artwork that suggested culture rather than wealth. "Mrs. Liston," she said, after her assistant had provided coffee and closed the door behind us, "Tom Reynolds at the chamber spoke very highly of you. He mentioned you might need some guidance on family legal matters." I had decided on complete honesty as my best strategy. My daughter and her husband are planning to petition for guardianship over my finances. They believe I'm mentally declining and making irresponsible financial decisions. They're wrong on both counts. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a serious allegation. What evidence do you have of their intentions?" I recounted the overheard conversation in detail, including their research into conservatorship laws, their documentation of my supposed financial irresponsibility, and their plans to use my Christmas gift purchases as evidence of impaired judgment. Margaret took notes throughout, occasionally asking clarifying questions with the precision of someone who had handled similar cases before. "This is more common than you might think," she said, when I finished. "Adult children often misinterpret a parent's lifestyle choices as evidence of decline, especially when they don't have complete information about the parent's financial situation. May I ask what your actual financial position is?" I pulled out the portfolio summary that my financial advisor had prepared for our meeting the previous day. Margaret's expression shifted as she scanned the numbers, $42.3 million in total assets, diversified across real estate, securities, and business holdings, with a monthly income that exceeded what most people earned annually. Well, she said, after a long pause, this certainly changes the dynamic. Your daughter and son-in-law are planning to seek guardianship over someone whose net worth exceeds that of most small corporations. The irony isn't lost on me, I replied. The question is how to protect myself from their legal action while also determining whether they deserve to benefit from the wealth they're trying to control. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying me with the intensity of someone solving a complex puzzle. There are several strategies we could employ. The most direct would be to arrange comprehensive cognitive and psychological evaluations that document your mental competency. We could also have your financial advisor provide testimony about your investment acumen and decision-making capabilities. Those are defensive measures, I said. I'm interested in something more proactive. What did you have in mind? I explained about the trust fund I had established for my grandchildren and my decision to suspend it based on their parents' behavior. Margaret listened without judgment as I outlined my desire to test whether Carly and Edward's treatment of me was driven by genuine concern or by greed and condescension. You want to create a situation where their true motivations become undeniable, she said, thoughtfully. That's possible, but it requires careful orchestration. If we're not strategic about this, it could backfire and actually support their case for guardianship. What do you suggest? Margaret pulled out a legal pad and began sketching a timeline. First, we document everything. I'll have my investigator discreetly verify the conversations you overheard and gather evidence of their research into guardianship procedures. Second, we arrange those competency evaluations I mentioned, but we do it proactively, before they can claim we're responding to their concerns. She paused, tapping her pen against the pad. Most importantly, we need to create a controlled environment where their motivations become clear. What if they discovered information about your actual financial situation gradually, in a way that tests their response at each stage? You mean reveal my wealth incrementally and observe how their behavior changes? Exactly. Right now they believe they're protecting a modestly comfortable elderly woman from financial mistakes. If they're genuinely motivated by love and concern, that attitude should remain consistent regardless of your actual net worth. But if they're motivated by greed or control, their behavior will change dramatically once they realize what's actually at stake. I finished. Margaret nodded. We could start small. Perhaps arrange for them to accidentally discover that you own your apartment complex. See how they respond to evidence that you're more financially secure than they assumed. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than defending myself against their assumptions, I would systematically reveal information that forced them to confront the truth about my situation. Their responses would create an undeniable record of their true motivations. How quickly can we put this into motion? I asked. The preliminary work can begin immediately. The investigator can start gathering evidence of their guardianship research today. I can arrange the competency evaluations for next week. As for the controlled revelations of your financial status, that depends on how subtle you want to be. I thought about Christmas morning, now just 5 days away. I want to move quickly. Let's say they discover I own the apartment complex by this weekend. That gives us time to observe their reaction before Christmas, and Christmas itself. Christmas will be the final test. They'll either demonstrate that they respect me, regardless of my financial situation, or they'll reveal themselves completely. Margaret closed her legal pad and extended her hand. Mrs. Liston, I have to say, this is one of the most interesting cases I've handled in years. Most of my clients are trying to prove they're competent despite evidence to the contrary. You're trying to prove your competence to people who refuse to see it despite overwhelming evidence. As I left Margaret's office, I felt the same sense of calm confidence that had guided me through decades of successful business decisions. Carly and Edward had made the mistake of underestimating not just my financial resources, but my intelligence and strategic thinking abilities. They were about to learn that the confused elderly woman they were planning to manage was actually several steps ahead of them. The first revelation was scheduled for Friday. By Christmas morning, I would know exactly what kind of people my daughter and son-in-law really were, and whether my grandchildren's trust fund would ever be restored. The game, as they say, was afoot. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp December clarity that made everything seem sharper, more defined. I had spent Thursday evening carefully orchestrating what Margaret Peterson had termed the controlled reveal, a seemingly accidental discovery that would force Carly and Edward to confront the first crack in their assumptions about my financial situation. The plan was elegantly simple. Carly had mentioned wanting to speak with Mrs. Howard from 3A about organizing a community potluck for New Year's Eve. I had volunteered to facilitate this conversation, knowing it would require Carly to visit the apartment complex during business hours when the management office would be active. What Carly didn't know was that Fridays were when Sunset Holdings, my property management company, conducted their weekly maintenance rounds and tenant meetings. She would arrive to find the complex buzzing with activity that might raise questions about who actually owned and operated Willowbrook Senior Community. I had positioned myself in the community room by 10 a.m., ostensibly reading but actually watching the parking lot through the large windows. At precisely 10:30, I saw Carly's silver SUV pull into the visitor space directly in front of the management office, where a large sign reading Sunset Holdings Property Management was clearly visible. She entered the building and knocked on my door with her usual cheerful energy. "Hi, Mom. Ready to talk to Mrs. Howard about the potluck?" "Of course, dear. She's expecting us in the community room." As we walked through the corridor, Carly couldn't help but notice the unusual activity. Maintenance workers were updating light fixtures, a grounds crew was installing new landscaping, and most prominently, two well-dressed individuals were conducting what appeared to be a formal inspection of the property. "Wow," Carly said, pausing to watch the activity. "They really keep this place nice. Must be expensive for the owners to maintain." "The management company is quite thorough," I replied, neutrally. Mrs. Howard was waiting for us with coffee and homemade cookies, exactly as planned. She was one of the few residents who knew about my ownership of the complex, having been my tenant for nearly 8 years. More importantly, she was someone who couldn't keep a secret if her life depended on it. "Marjorie," she exclaimed, as we entered. "Perfect timing. I was just telling the nice gentleman from Sunset Holdings about our potluck idea. He seemed very interested in supporting community events." Carly's attention sharpened. "Sunset Holdings, are they the management company?" "Oh yes, Miss Howard replied with the enthusiasm of someone who loved being the center of attention. "They've been wonderful to work with, very responsive to tenant concerns. And Marjorie here has been instrumental in improving our community amenities. Haven't you, dear?" I felt Carly's eyes on me as Mrs. Howard continued chattering about property improvements and community initiatives. The conversation gradually revealed details that would have been impossible to ignore. My involvement in approving renovations, my input on landscaping decisions, my knowledge of maintenance schedules and tenant concerns. "Mom," Carly said slowly, "how do you know so much about the property management decisions?" Mrs. Howard answered before I could respond. "Oh, didn't you know? Your mother is very interested in making sure our community stays nice." I interrupted gently but firmly. "I've been working with the management company on various improvements, but the damage was done." Carly spent the rest of our meeting with Mrs. Howard asking increasingly pointed questions about my involvement with property operations. Questions I deflected as much as possible while still allowing her to piece together the obvious conclusion. After we left Mrs. Howard's apartment, Carly was unusually quiet as we walked back through the bustling complex. I could practically see her mental gears turning, processing the evidence of activity and investment that suggested this wasn't just low-income senior housing, but a well-maintained, professionally managed property. "Mom," she said finally, as we reached my apartment door, "can I ask you something directly?" "Oh, of course. Do you have some kind of financial arrangement with the management company here? Like, are you getting a discount on your rent in exchange for helping them with tenant relations or something?" The question revealed how desperately she was trying to reconcile what she had observed with her existing beliefs about my financial situation. Even faced with clear evidence of my involvement in property management decisions, she was constructing explanations that preserved her assumption of my limited means. "It's a bit more complicated than that," I said carefully. "What do you mean?" I unlocked my apartment door and gestured for her to come inside. This was the moment of truth, the first test of how she would respond to evidence that challenged her fundamental assumptions about my circumstances. Carly, I need to tell you something important about my living situation here. She sat down on my small sofa, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. Are you in some kind of trouble? Is that why you've been acting strange lately? I'm not in trouble. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I took a deep breath. I don't just live in this complex, dear. I own it. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the maintenance crew working in the courtyard outside. Carly's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, calculation, and finally something that looked almost like anger. You own it? She repeated slowly. You own this entire apartment complex? Through Sunset Holdings, yes, I've owned it for several years. But that means, she stopped, clearly struggling to process the implications. Mom, if you own this place, that means you're not living here because you have to. You're living here because you want to. That's correct. Carly stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the property she was now realizing belonged to her mother. When she turned back to me, her expression had hardened in a way I had never seen before. What else haven't you told me? She asked, her voice tight with something that sounded more like accusation than curiosity. What other properties do you own? What other lies have you been telling us about your financial situation? The word lies hit me like a slap. This wasn't the response of a daughter relieved to discover her mother was more financially secure than she had feared. This was the reaction of someone who felt deceived and perhaps cheated out of something they believed they were entitled to. I haven't lied to anyone, I said quietly. I simply chose to live modestly regardless of my financial capabilities. Chose to live modestly, she repeated, her voice growing sharper. While letting us worry about you, while letting us feel guilty about not being able to help you more. Do you have any idea how much time Edward and I have spent discussing your financial situation? How much we've worried about your future? The conversation was going exactly as Margaret Peterson had predicted it might. Faced with evidence of my actual financial position, Carly wasn't expressing relief or happiness. She was expressing anger at being excluded from information she felt entitled to possess. I appreciate your concern, I began. Concern, she interrupted. Mom, we've been making decisions based on completely false information. We've been treating you like a charity case? I suggested quietly. The accusation hung in the air between us, undeniable and damning. For the first time, Carly seemed to realize how her behavior over the past weeks had actually appeared from my perspective. But instead of apologizing or showing any recognition of how condescending she had been, she doubled down on her anger. You should have told us, she said firmly. Family doesn't keep secrets like this. That evening, Margaret Peterson called with an update that confirmed my worst fears about how quickly the situation was deteriorating. My investigator has been monitoring their communications, she said without preamble. Carly called Edward immediately after leaving your apartment today. The conversation was illuminating. I settled into my reading chair, preparing myself for whatever revelation was coming. How bad is it? They're accelerating their guardianship plans. Edward contacted 3 different lawyers today asking about emergency conservatorship procedures. They're no longer talking about a gradual process. They want to move fast, before you can hide what they now assume are significant assets. The irony was devastating. My attempt to gradually reveal the truth about my financial situation had backfired spectacularly. Instead of seeing evidence of my competence and capability, Carly and Edward had interpreted my property ownership as proof that I was hiding assets that rightfully belonged to the family. What exactly did they discuss? I asked. Margaret's voice carried a note of professional disgust. According to the recording, Carly is convinced you're suffering from what she called financial hoarding behavior. She believes you're sitting on significant wealth while pretending to be poor, which she sees as evidence of mental illness rather than a rational choice. And Edward is more focused on the practical implications. He spent considerable time calculating the potential value of your property holdings and discussing how to ensure those assets are properly managed for the family's benefit. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. They're not concerned about my well-being at all anymore, are they? From what I can tell, Their primary concern is gaining control of what they now realize is a substantial estate before you can take steps to protect it from them. Edward specifically mentioned that you might try to dispose of assets irresponsibly now that you know they're aware of your wealth. The betrayal was complete. My own daughter and her husband were now actively working to have me declared incompetent specifically so they could prevent me from controlling my own money. The woman who had spent 30 years building a financial empire through careful planning and strategic thinking was being characterized as mentally ill for the crime of living. There's more, Margaret continued. They're planning to present evidence of your delusional behaviors to the court. Carly has documented what she calls proof of your declining mental state, including your insistence on buying expensive Christmas gifts and your inability to recognize your financial limitations. So my generosity toward my grandchildren is now evidence of dementia. In their narrative, yes. They're arguing that your recent erratic spending combined with the revelation of hidden assets demonstrates a pattern of financial decision-making that puts you and the family at risk. I walked to my window and looked out at the apartment complex I owned, watching residents going about their evening routines in units that generated steady rental income. The scope of Carly and Edward's misunderstanding was almost breathtaking. They had constructed an elaborate fantasy where I was simultaneously too poor to afford decent gifts and too wealthy to manage responsibly. "What's our timeline?" I asked. "They're planning to file preliminary paperwork on Monday." Edward found a lawyer who specializes in emergency conservatorships. Apparently, he's willing to argue that your pattern of financial deception constitutes an immediate threat that requires court intervention. Monday. That gave me exactly 3 days before my own family would attempt to legally strip me of my autonomy and financial control. 3 days to demonstrate that the confused elderly woman they were planning to manage was actually more strategically capable than they had ever imagined. "Margaret, I want to move to the next phase of our plan immediately. Are you certain, once we escalate this, there's no going back? Your relationship with your daughter may be irreparably damaged." I thought about the trust fund documents sitting in my safe, about the grandchildren who deserved better than parents who saw their grandmother as either a charity case or a financial threat to be controlled. I thought about Randy, who had taught me that the most important investment was in character, not assets. "The relationship is already damaged beyond repair," I said. "At least this way, I'll know the truth about who they really are." "What do you want to do?" "I want them to discover the full scope of my financial situation before they file their paperwork. Let them understand exactly what they're trying to take control of. And I want it documented, every conversation, every reaction, every decision they make once they realize what's actually at stake." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Marjorie, I have to ask, are you prepared for the possibility that their behavior will get worse once they understand your true net worth? Right now, they think they're dealing with a property owner. When they discover you're worth $40 million, they'll reveal themselves completely," I finished. "Which is exactly what I need them to do. And if they still proceed with the guardianship petition after learning the truth about your wealth, then I'll know with absolute certainty that my decision to suspend the grandchildren's trust fund was the right one. And I'll have all the evidence I need to ensure they never see a penny of my estate." We spent the next hour planning what Margaret called the full disclosure scenario. By Sunday evening, Carly and Edward would have access to complete information about my financial empire. Their response to that information would determine not just the fate of the guardianship proceedings, but the entire future of our family relationships. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that Christmas was now just 2 days away. What should have been a joyous revelation of my gift to my grandchildren's future had become a test of whether their parents possessed the basic character traits that would make them worthy guardians of such wealth. The expensive gifts I had purchased for Manny and Candace were still wrapped and waiting under my small Christmas tree, but the real gift, the trust fund that could have secured their entire futures, remained suspended in legal limbo, awaiting proof that their parents understood the difference between love and control, between concern and greed. Based on the events of the past 24 hours, that proof was becoming increasingly unlikely to emerge. But I had been wrong before. Perhaps Christmas morning would still bring the miracle of genuine understanding and respect that could restore our family bonds. Or perhaps it would bring the final confirmation that some relationships cannot survive the weight of their own contradictions. Either way, I would know the truth by Monday morning. Saturday morning brought the execution of Margaret Peterson's full disclosure scenario with surgical precision. At exactly 9 a.m., a messenger arrived at Carly and Edward's house with an unmarked envelope containing documents that would shatter every assumption they had made about my financial situation. The package included property deeds showing my ownership of 12 rental complexes across 3 counties, business registration documents for Sunset Holdings and its subsidiary companies, and a net worth statement prepared by my financial advisor that laid out the complete scope of my $40 million empire in stark, undeniable numbers. Margaret's investigator was positioned across the street when Edward signed for the delivery, and the recording equipment was already in place to capture their reaction when they opened it. I sat in my apartment, sipping coffee and waiting for the phone call that would reveal whether my daughter and son-in-law possessed any capacity for shame or self-reflection. The call came at 9:47 a.m. "Mom." Carly's voice was different, tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. "We need to talk, now." "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" Just don't." Her composure cracked slightly. "We're coming over. We'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead, leaving me in the strange position of waiting for my own family to arrive and confront me about my success. Through my window I could see Mrs. Howard tending her flowers in the courtyard garden, completely unaware that her landlady was about to face what might be the most important conversation of her life. When Carly and Edward arrived, their faces carried the shell-shocked expressions of people whose fundamental worldview had just collapsed. Edward clutched the envelope of documents like evidence in a criminal case, while Carly looked at me as if seeing a stranger. $40 million, Edward said without preamble. $40 million. I remained seated in my reading chair, keeping my voice calm. "Yes, that sounds about right. My advisor updates those figures quarterly." "This is insane," Carly said, beginning to pace in the small space. "You own half the county's rental properties, you have business investments, commercial real estate, stock portfolios, you're basically a millionaire dozens of times over. I prefer to think of it as financially secure." Edward dropped into the chair across from me, the documents scattered across his lap. "Do you understand what this means? Do you have any idea what you've put us through? We've been planning to file guardianship papers on Monday to protect you from your own financial mistakes, and it turns out you're one of the wealthiest people in the state." "I'm aware of the irony," I replied. "Irony?" Carly stopped pacing and stared at me. "This isn't irony, Mom. This is deliberate deception. You've been watching us worry about your finances, letting us treat you like you're struggling, all while sitting on a fortune that could fund a small government." The anger in her voice was unmistakable now, not the frustration of someone who had been worried about a loved one, but the rage of someone who felt they had been cheated out of something valuable. "And what exactly should I have done differently?" I asked. "You should have told us," Edward burst out. "We're your family. We have a right to know about assets like this. They affect all of us." There it was, the entitlement that had been lurking beneath all their concern and condescension. In Edward's mind, my wealth didn't belong to me alone, but to the family collectively, and my failure to disclose it was a betrayal of their rights as my inheritors. "How do they affect you, Edward?" He gestured at the documents. "Estate planning, tax implications, investment strategies. These are generational wealth decisions that impact our children's futures. You can't just hide this kind of money and make unilateral choices about it." "Actually," I said quietly, "I can. It's my money." The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge. For perhaps the first time in their lives, Carly and Edward were being forced to confront the reality that my financial resources belonged to me alone, to dispose of as I saw fit, regardless of their expectations or desires. "This changes everything," Carly said finally. "Everything we've been planning, everything we've been worried about, it's all been based on lies, not lies, simply information you weren't entitled to possess." And there, in that moment, I saw the final proof I had been seeking. Faced with evidence of my financial competence and success, my daughter and son-in-law weren't expressing relief or admiration. They were expressing anger at being excluded from decisions about wealth they felt should have been theirs to influence from the beginning. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made everything crystalline and sharp. I had slept surprisingly well, perhaps because the clarity of yesterday's confrontation had finally provided the answers I had been seeking for weeks. There would be no miraculous reconciliation, no sudden recognition of their mistakes, no tearful apologies for years of condescension disguised as concern. I prepared coffee and sat by my small Christmas tree, looking at the carefully wrapped gifts I had bought for Manny and Candace. The telescope for his love of astronomy, the deluxe art set for her creative passion, presents chosen with the same thoughtfulness I had once planned to put into revealing their $3.2 million trust fund. At 8:30 a.m., my phone rang. Carly's voice was artificially bright with the kind of forced cheer that comes from a sleepless night of strategic planning.
Merry Christmas, Mom.
The kids are so excited to see you today. We'll be over around 10 to pick you up for dinner. I'm afraid there's been a change of plans, dear. I won't be joining you for Christmas dinner. The pause was brief but telling. What do you mean? Of course you're joining us. It's Christmas. I've decided to spend the day quietly here. Please give my love to Manny and Candace. I have gifts for them that you can take with you. Mom, this is ridiculous. We need to talk about what happened yesterday, about the financial situation. We can work through this as a family. There was that word again, family. In Carly's vocabulary, it had become synonymous with people entitled to control my decisions. There's nothing to work through, I said calmly. You've made your feelings about my choices quite clear. Look, I know we were shocked yesterday. Maybe we said some things we didn't mean. But keeping secrets like this, it's not healthy, Mom. It's not normal behavior. Even now, even after learning the truth about my financial competence, she was still characterizing my privacy as evidence of mental instability. Some patterns of thinking, I realized, were too deeply ingrained to change. Carly, let me ask you something. Over the past few weeks, when you brought me groceries I didn't need, when you offered to pay for gifts I could easily afford, when you spoke to your friends about my supposed poverty, were you motivated by love for me, or by pity for what you assumed was my unfortunate situation? The question clearly caught her off guard. We were trying to help, we thought you were struggling. And now that you know I'm not struggling, now that you know I've been more financially successful than you ever imagined, how do you feel about me now? Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of frustrated honesty. I feel like I don't know who you are anymore. The mother I thought I knew wouldn't keep secrets like this. She wouldn't let her family worry unnecessarily. She wouldn't make unilateral decisions about money that affects all of us. So the mother you loved was the one you thought was poor and needed your management. The mother you're angry with is the one who turned out to be successful and independent. That's not what I'm saying. Isn't it? The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of truths neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Finally, Carly spoke again, and for the first time in weeks, her voice carried genuine emotion instead of calculated strategy. What do you want from us, Mom? What would it take for us to get past this? It was a fair question, and I considered it carefully before answering. I want you to understand that respect isn't conditional on circumstances. I want you to recognize that treating someone like a charity case, even with good intentions, is still disrespectful. And I want you to accept that my financial decisions are mine to make, regardless of how they might affect your expectations about inheritance. And if we can do that, I looked at the trust fund documents in my safe, thinking about the grandchildren who deserved better than parents who saw relationships in terms of financial advantage. Then perhaps we can rebuild something genuine. But Carly, it would have to be genuine, not strategic, not calculated based on what you think you might gain or lose. I need to think about this, she said finally. This is all happening so fast. Take all the time you need. But understand that my decision about Christmas dinner stands. I'll be spending the day reflecting on family, and what it really means. After I hung up, I wrapped the children's gifts and set them by the door for whenever Carly came to collect them. Then I walked to my safe and removed the suspended trust fund documents, spreading them across my kitchen table like cards in a game where all the rules had changed. $3.2 million, earning interest in a holding account, waiting for beneficiaries who might never materialize. The money that was supposed to secure my grandchildren's futures, created by a grandmother their parents had tried to have declared incompetent. Outside my window, other families were beginning their Christmas celebrations, gathering in warmth and genuine affection. I felt no self-pity at spending the day alone. Solitude chosen freely was far preferable to company that came with strings attached. The test was complete. The results were clear. Now I had to decide what to do with the knowledge I had gained. 3 months later, I stood in the boardroom of the newly established Liston Family Foundation, looking out at the 10 scholarship recipients who would be the first beneficiaries of what the local newspaper had called the most significant educational endowment in the county's history. The trust fund that had once been designated for Manny and Candace had found a new purpose, supporting children whose families understood the value of education, but lacked the resources to pursue it. The application process had been rigorous, focusing not just on academic merit, but on character, integrity, and the kind of genuine gratitude that my own grandchildren might never learn. Margaret Peterson sat at the conference table, reviewing the legal documents that had formalized this transformation. "You know," she said quietly, "in 30 years of practice, I've never seen someone convert personal disappointment into community benefit quite so systematically." "It wasn't disappointment," I corrected. "It was clarity." The past 3 months had indeed brought remarkable clarity. Carly and Edward had ultimately decided not to file their guardianship petition, partly because Margaret's preemptive competency evaluations had made their case legally impossible, but mostly because they had finally grasped that my wealth was real, substantial, and completely under my control. Their behavior had shifted dramatically once they understood the true scope of what was at stake. The condescending phone calls about my supposed financial limitations had been replaced by carefully respectful inquiries about my estate planning intentions. The unsolicited grocery deliveries had given way to expensive gifts clearly chosen to curry favor. The casual discussions of my declining mental state with friends had transformed into public praise for my incredible business acumen. But by then, it was far too late for such strategic adjustments to matter. I had spent Christmas Day alone, as promised, and found it surprisingly peaceful. While my daughter's family exchanged gifts they assumed I couldn't afford, I had worked on the foundation's charter documents, creating something that would outlast any family dysfunction and benefit children who truly deserved opportunity. The gifts I had bought for Manny and Candace remained wrapped in my closet. Carly had never come to collect them, perhaps because doing so would have required acknowledging that her concerns about my overspending had been completely unfounded. On New Year's Day, I had called Jay Bridge and instructed him to make the trust fund suspension permanent. The money would remain in the holding account, earning interest, until I decided on its ultimate disposition. Given what I had learned about my daughter and son-in-law's true character, that decision had become increasingly clear. "The foundation is ready to begin operations," Margaret announced, closing the legal folder. "The first scholarship disbursements will go out next week." I nodded, thinking about the 10 young people who would soon discover that their college dreams were no longer impossible. Children from working families who had never expected such opportunities, who would receive this gift with genuine appreciation, rather than entitled assumption. Through the conference room window, I could see the new sign being installed in front of the building: Liston Family Foundation invested in character and education. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's name would now be associated with values that my own descendants had failed to demonstrate. My phone buzzed with a text message from Carly. "Mom, we need to discuss the children's college funds. Can we meet this week?" I deleted the message without responding. Some conversations were no longer worth having. That evening, I returned to my apartment at Willowbrook Senior Community, the property I owned but where I chose to live simply. "Mrs. Howard waved from her garden as I parked, and I realized that these genuine relationships with people who knew nothing of my wealth were more valuable than any family connection built on financial expectation. I had started this journey believing that money was the greatest gift I could give my grandchildren. I had ended it understanding that the greatest gift was teaching them, through example, that respect, integrity, and genuine affection couldn't be purchased or inherited. The trust fund was gone. The family relationships might be irreparably damaged, but I had accomplished something far more important. I had refused to reward entitlement with generosity, condescension with wealth, or manipulation with inheritance. Randy would have been proud. More importantly, I was finally proud of myself. In the end, the woman who couldn't afford decent Christmas gifts had proven she could afford something far more valuable: her self-respect. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.